Hello, what is going on, guys? Hockey Guy 1 here. Welcome to my review of Star Wars The Phantom Menace. Star Wars The Phantom Menace is directed by George Lucas and stars Liam Neeson, Ewan McGregor, Natalie Portman, Ian McDermott, Jake Lloyd, Frank Oz, Roy Park, and Anthony Daniels. The story is about the Trade Federation just kind of like invading Naboo, so they basically have to try and evacuate it, and then they kind of go on Tatooine. They end up running into Anakin, where Qui-Gon tries to free him and ends up working, so he kind of brings him back to Coruscant to try and get him to train and become a Jedi. And then they kind of like go back to Naboo to try and stop the Trade Federation from completely taking it over. For positives, Liam Neeson and Ewan McGregor does do a pretty good job in their respective roles as Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, as they both do feel like their characters. They both at least try to make that terrible script look good, and really try their best with delivering the lines, despite when they're not exactly the best lines, and just they do feel very confident with what they're saying. And they both do have some pretty good chemistry with each other, as they both do feel like they belong together and kind of working together well. And there's a lightsaber duel with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon against Darth Maul, which is pretty much like the only great thing about this movie. I mean, and it's just like very engaging, and it's really the only part that like keeps me into the movie. And it's like the only part I can really severely enjoy about this movie. I mean, it's an action scene that's pretty engaging and had a lot of tension to it, and even does end up killing off Qui-Gon Jinn, of course. And then, of course, you get to see, like, Obi-Wan jump in there, do flip and cut Darth Maul in half, which is, like, you could pretty cool thing to see Obi-Wan doing his prime, and it is really good to see that, and it's honestly about it. I mean, it's just that lightsaber duel that's just really fun to watch, and just feels really engaging, even if it doesn't really make that much sense. I do kind of like the makeup design for Darth Maul. I mean, it does kind of give you the intimidating feel with the makeup design, as you can definitely tell it took a lot of time to go through that makeup, and it just looks pretty impressive. I mean, I kind of like all the black and then red kind of going back and forth kind of thing. Yes, I do really like how they did that, despite the fact that he doesn't really do much in this movie, but it does at least have some pretty good makeup for him. That said, this movie does have a ton of negatives. Starting off with the story, which is just a complete mess. I mean, it's just all over the place. It kind of starts out like, oh, we need to do this political thing on Naboo and trying to have this invasion, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we gotta go to Tatooine because we need the free Anakin, which doesn't even make sense to be in the story because it doesn't really have any connection to any of the Naboo stuff, as it's just basically they need Anakin in this movie, they need him to get free. That's really the only reason why this stuff exists. It's all pointless filler, and then there's kind of all this Naboo stuff that they come back to it because they're like, oh yeah, that's right, that's what the story was supposed to be about. And it's just like completely all over the place, doesn't create anything consistent. It's just a complete mess that it kind of felt like George Lucas didn't exactly know what he was doing before filming this. Structure is just a complete joke. I mean, there's barely even a structure to this story. I mean, there's the first act, which is pretty much like, oh, look, Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon are on this Trade Federation ship negotiating about Naboo, and the second act's like, oh, we gotta try and escape that, and oh, we gotta go to Tatooine because we need Anakin. And then a bunch of pointless filler, like the pod racing scenes, and a bunch of other things showing Anakin on Tatooine that's basically pointless filler. It just kind of makes the second act really bad. And then there's the third act, which is pretty much just it's like, we need to come back to what we were doing, because that's what the main story is supposed to be about, and to be honest, it just doesn't really make sense. It basically doesn't even seem like there is a structure to it, as pretty much George Lucas just seemed like he didn't really know what he was doing when writing the story and the structure, as it's just a complete mess. It's like all over the place. The pacing is just awful. I mean, this movie is around the same runtime as Return of the Jedi, and it honestly feels like it's twice as long as Return of the Jedi because of how much pointless filler there is in this movie. I mean, it just makes the movie feel like it's so much longer, and it just makes it like really boring, to be honest. I mean, it's just, there's no point of adding in so much filler to the point where the movie just feels like it's so long, and it feels like this movie never ends. I mean, it's pretty much, I'm just waiting for the end credits because the movie is just so long, and it just feels like it's even longer than the runtime says, and it's just a complete boring mess because of all the filler. Dialogue is pretty much just a complete joke. I mean, at least it's not as bad as it gets in the nice movie, but still, the dialogue in this movie is still, like, very bad. I mean, there's some lines like, are you an angel? That doesn't even make any sort of sense, as he said, and it just makes me cringe, if anything. I mean, it doesn't even make remotely any sense to put a line like that in a movie like this. And then there are like a bunch of other lines. Like, surprised to be Sherman a welcome one, but it doesn't exactly make that much sense. And just basically all the dialogue is like so bad. There have been many memes on it, and then it's just the dialogue here just doesn't work for the movie, and it's just really bad. Qui-Gon Jinn, I mean, there's pretty much nothing to him. I mean, he's pretty much just a Jedi who wants to try and save Anakin, and to be honest, that's pretty much his character. There's absolutely nothing to him. There's barely any layers to his character. It's pretty much just a Jedi who's training Obi-Wan and wants to free Anakin. That's pretty much his entire character, and it's just a complete joke. He barely grows throughout this movie, so his death pretty much just doesn't really get to me that much because it just doesn't make that much sense. You know what I'm saying? He barely grows, so making him die doesn't really make you feel that much emotion for him, and there's just barely any character to him. Anakin is supposed to be like the main protagonist of this whole trilogy, but in this movie, he just feels completely empty. I mean, there's basically nothing to his character. I mean, he does like the pod race and just is a slave and then gets free, but that's pretty much the only character that's kind of different about the character, and it's just, there's nothing special about him, to be honest. And he does end up destroying the Trade Federation ship, but at, like, what cost? He, like, barely grew throughout this movie, and then all of a sudden just destroys that Trade Federation ship. So it's just kind of doesn't really make you feel that happy. I mean, the only thing that can make you feel happy is that it's near the end of the movie, basically. And honestly, that's pretty much it. That's literally all he did in this movie, to be honest. And it's just completely wordless, to be honest, because he didn't even grow before doing that. He just felt like the same exact character as he was when we first met him, because he barely grew throughout this movie, as there's just really nothing to his character. Obi-Wan, he's just completely wasted in this movie. I mean, he's just basically completely sidelined for a lot of this movie. I mean, he just kind of stays on the ship while Qui-Gon, like, out in Tatooine, and to be honest, I mean, I guess there are some cool things about Obi-Wan. Like, I guess you did get to see him in his prime, kind of after Darth Maul, but still, overall for his character, just doesn't really do anything much in this movie. I mean, and he just basically doesn't have much character in this movie, just pretty much sad. And I mean, he does end up training Anakin, but we don't really know much about his force power and how much he grew, so So it's just basically worthless again. And so in this movie, he just feels completely wasted and just feels like he barely really grew in it. Padme is just completely terrible in this movie. I mean, she's pretty much just like the queen of Naboo, and most of the time it's not really showing her as the queen of Naboo because she kind of uses a decoy to put in her spot. And to be honest, it's just a complete joke what they did with her character in this movie. I mean, she pretty much does go on the mission with Qui-Gon, but doesn't really do much on him, and really her growth with Anakin doesn't really make sense. I mean, it's kind of like they just meet each other, and it's like they want to remember each other for whatever reason, because despite the fact that they didn't really do much with her in this movie, and to be honest, she just doesn't really feel like a strong character in this, as really she just isn't really doing much. She's just on the mission, and that's about it. Jar Jar Binks is without a doubt the worst character in all of Star Wars. I mean, he's just so annoying all the time. I mean, he is a comic relief, but he doesn't even do anything funny. Really, his character is just, he's clumsy all the time, and pretty much is there to annoy the audience. I mean, I don't know what else there is to him. I mean, it's just that anything he does just does not make him funny whatsoever. I mean, I don't know how being clumsy is really gonna make you laugh that much. I mean, it's basically what it is. And then he just basically just tries to annoy the audience. It feels like, and just some of the line something tries to say is just completely terrible, and just his whole character is just completely terrible and annoying, because every single joke he tries to put out just doesn't work, and just feels like it shouldn't really be in this movie. Palpatine is just awful in this movie. I mean, he is obviously supposed to be the main antagonist throughout this pretty much whole franchise, but his plan just doesn't make sense in this movie. I mean, his plan involves becoming the Chancellor, but it's full of coincidences that doesn't even make sense. I mean, it's pretty much just, he just tries to get the Chancellor Blonde, or whatever the Chancellor's name is in this movie, just try it and get the throne because of a bunch of taboo things that he's not really helping out with. But it's just full of coincidences that doesn't even remotely make sense, so we can't really take him seriously in this movie. Darth Maul is just a terrible villain. I mean, he does basically nothing throughout this movie. I mean, he just looks for Qui-Gon and then kind of just fights Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. That's about the only things he does throughout this movie. I mean, he barely has any screen time. Just feels like filler and isn't really intimidating, because basically his whole character is just barely in the movie, and it just feels like they just put him in there because this movie needed a villain other than Palpatine. Natalie Portman is just terrible in her role as Padme in this movie. I mean, she just looked completely unconfident every time she delivered a line. She looked like she wanted out of this movie as fast as she can. And at the same time, don't really blame her. I mean, it's kind of in a bad movie, but still, I mean, she still had to at least try it and make her look like she wants to be there. But the way she's, like, delivering her line is just so unconfident that it feels like she didn't want to be there. And then the same thing could be said about Jake Lloyd, but I guess he is a child and nobody else could have done good in the role. I mean, I don't think a single child actor could possibly make these lines from George Lucas actually look good. Visual effects in this movie are just awful. I mean, the CGI just feels like it's completely incomplete around this. I mean, and that's just saying something. I mean, this movie uses a lot of CGI, but like whenever you see like people like Jar Jar on screen, it just looks completely incomplete. I mean, it just looks like they didn't really try that much with it, and it looks like it doesn't even fit in this movie even. Like, same thing goes for like any creature that you really see on Tatooine. I mean, all of them just look completely incomplete and doesn't even seem like they fit into this movie, because the skin tone of each of them just isn't even smooth looks completely incomplete. Cinematography is just awful. I mean, there's so many times when they unnecessarily used a bunch of different camera angles for one scene. I mean, it's just completely unnecessary. Some of the scenes, like that one scene with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan kind of like destroying these battle droids. They kind of show a bunch of unnecessary shots in that. Like, for example, like that one shot where it kind of showed Obi-Wan like flipping his lightsaber around and then injecting it. That was like a completely useless camera angle that doesn't even make sense for the scene, and just felt like it was in there just because it needs to look cool. And then there are a lot of other scenes, like the scene where there's Padme and like all of her people in the Naboo trying to like through against the battle droids. Like that scene also unnecessarily used a bunch of camera angles, and just doesn't really feel like it even needed that many camera angles as they used. And it's just completely unnecessary. And then there's like a couple of wide shots like you could barely even see what's going on. I mean, there were multiple times where there was like another character in the way of the camera that just felt like they needed a different camera angle for that scene. And even like this wide shot where they tried showing the droid in the distance, you can barely see them even. The editing is just terrible. I mean, the movie just feels very choppy, like whenever it goes from one shot to another, because it just kind of feels like the scene is kind of like incomplete, and as the editing is kind of choppy as it kind of goes from one shot to another like super fast, and then whenever it goes from one scene to another, they use like this ridiculous wipe thing that doesn't even make any sense to put in there. Like, I kind of get how it can be effective in some times, but like in this movie, they just use it in nearly every single scene to get to the next scene, and it's just kind of annoying that they use it. I mean, it's completely overused to use a wipe. I mean, you don't really need it for every little scene change, and it seems like they just chose to do it for every single scene. Designs, they're like barely any. I mean, most of this is just filmed blandly in front of a green screen, but like when they actually do use an actual set like the Naboo Palace, it just kind of looks bland, to be honest. I mean, it doesn't really look anything special, the Naboo Palace, at all. I mean, it just really feels like a palace, and that's about it. I mean, there's really nothing much to it. I mean, it doesn't really have that good looks. It doesn't really feel that much like a palace. I mean, it just kind of looks bland, to be honest. Overall, Star Wars The Phantom Menace is just a complete disaster of a movie, and it's a terrible start to the prequel trilogy. So I'm going to give Star Wars The Phantom Menace a 2 out of 10. That was my review of Star Wars The Phantom Menace. What are your thoughts on Star Wars The Phantom Menace? Tell me in the comments below. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.